Well, good evening, everybody. It is time for Wednesday night worship. Hope you're all excited to be here and to tune in tonight. Sheldon and I are trying something, wouldn't be a Wednesday night if we weren't trying something different and new. But just to let you all know, we are pre-recording tonight in order that we can be a little more attentive to the stream, and also because we're having streaming issues with YouTube. So we're pre-recording. However, someone will be monitoring the stream tonight. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, we'd love to see you. We'd love to hear from you as you pop on. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and so we will be there. Someone will be there to respond, to reply, answer any questions you might have. So it's good to be here. It's interesting to do it at 3 in the afternoon rather than at 6:30 at night, but we'll give it a shot and see how it goes. So. We are continuing tonight in our series on the mission and vision of the church, this particular church of Longview Church of Nazarene. So last week we talked about and we began our understanding of vision, that we are a Christ-like community that desires to make Christ-like disciples in the nation. So that was last week. This week we are taking kind of a different tack, going a different direction with this, although it's all related, right? Again, as I said last week, we're very intentional about keeping that making Christ-like disciples in there first, because that is what is, we believe, most important first and foremost. The last thing that Jesus said to his disciples was make disciples. So we believe that is primary in our vision. However, the rest of the stuff, the next, tonight and the next 3 weeks following, there are no particular order, at least no in They're random order, I guess, as far as ranked importance. But tonight I want to talk about, Sheldon, can you slide the cursor over to, there we go, I think. There it is. Okay. We're recording, and we just got to make sure that we got our PowerPoint and everything worked out. So again, all of our vision statements are based on the premise that we are called to be a Christ-like community right? So that makes disciples. And then tonight we're going to talk about how we are a community that extends radical hospitality. I do want to note from the outset, wording is important, and we have chosen these words carefully and deliberately. So all of these particular things, as you read it, none of the words are accidental or incidental. We have chosen them very carefully. So if any of this particular phrase bothers you, well, we chose it very specifically. And especially that middle word, that radical, is intended to be a bit, it's not off-putting, but a bit unsettling. Let's just put it that way. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So I want to start tonight, because we are addressing a particular scripture text, but I want to make sure that I set the text in context and how I'm going to talk about it tonight. So we have this text, and it's a wonderful text, and it is actually referred to other times in both the Old and New Testament, this particular text that we're going to talk about. However, it is addressed in different ways in different parts of the Old and New Testament. Different aspects of it are drawn out and brought out. But tonight, in particular, I want to make sure that we ground our discussion, at least, in as far as hospitality goes, in the Gospel of Ezekiel, as this text is referenced in the book from the prophet Ezekiel. So I want to read that first, just again to ground us and to let you all know where I am coming from as we are dealing with this particular text, because the text I'm using tonight may not immediately be obvious as to why I would be using it for hospitality, okay? So I'm going to ground it first in Ezekiel. So Ezekiel 16:49-50 says, "This is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud and had plenty to eat and enjoyed peace and prosperity, but she didn't help the poor and the needy. They became haughty and did detestable things in front of me, and I turned away from them as soon as I saw it." So we're going to be talking tonight about the wonderful text in Genesis, that is the story of Lot and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we're going to talk about this as an example and exemplary of hospitality in the ancient world. And so here it goes. I will read the text from Genesis 19, 1 through 11. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men of every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, do not do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them what you would like with them, but don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of the way," they replied. "This fellow has come here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play judge. We will treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so they could not find the door. All right, so as we move into this text, again, it may not be obvious why I've chosen this particular text to talk about hospitality. And so just a little bit of context before we delve into it. First of all, if you recall that the story of Genesis 18, and particularly the story that happens is Abraham is camped by the oaks of Mamre. It's a very, very particular point that the Old Testament writer points out. But he's there and he sees 3 men coming towards him, 3 angels. But we learn later on that this is the Lord. One of them or 3 of them are the Lord. We don't really know. We can't really tell. But basically, this is where God comes to Abraham and promises him that he will have a son. Now, this is after Ishmael is born, but God comes to Abraham and promises that he will have a son and that Sarah will be the mother, right? So that's kind of what's going on here. Abraham welcomes them and talks with them, gives them a meal. All this interchange takes place. They give the promise that he will be, right, the father of a son, and that Sarah will be the mother. And then as the angels leave, it's almost as if they've stopped by Abraham, and then he was kind of just on the way, and they're actually headed to Sodom and Gomorrah. So as the text tells us, that there was a great evil in Sodom and Gomorrah, and that God had gone basically to check things out. But as God is leaving Abraham's presence, basically God has this own interior dialogue of being reminded that Abraham is a covenant partner. And so God actually says, I should tell Abraham what I am up to, because Abraham is my covenant partner. I'm going to tell him, and his nephew lives there, and he deserves to know what I am doing. And so God has this discussion with Abraham about what God intends for Sodom, that God's going to go and destroy it because it is utterly wicked, the people are depraved, all that sort of things like that. And as we get into it, we see, I don't want to get too far into this, but how important that covenant relationship between God and Abraham is, right? Abraham is brought into the discussion, brought into sort of the decision-making of Almighty God, which is fascinating. That God, it's not just God saying, you're my covenant partner, you'll do what I say, and I'll give you rewards. It's God actually having kind of this covenant relationship and response and call to Abraham, so that God brings in Abraham on God's plans. And what ultimately happens is Abraham is sort of shocked that God would destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Abraham says, wait, are you going to kill the righteous along with the wicked? Right? Abraham's okay with sort of the justice on the wicked, but not on the righteous. And so Abraham begins to say, well, if there's 50 righteous there, will you still destroy it? I mean, would you really kill 50 righteous people for the sake of judgment on the town? And God says, no, for 50 I would spare it. And then Abraham goes down and down and down and gets God to say, for 10, God would spare the city. So Abraham is not only part of God's plans, but actually gets to have kind of part in the decision-making process of what God is going to do and how God is going to work, which is fascinating and wonderful and a completely other story. So, but that's the context. So after Abraham and God have this sort of conversation, God says, yes, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy the city. God goes on into Sodom, right? And that is where our text picks up as God goes into Sodom in the form of these two angels, these two messengers. God goes into Sodom and kind of takes a look around to see how things are. So that's kind of where we'll start our text today. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting at the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed his face to the ground. My lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house so you can wash your feet, spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning. No, they answered, we will spend the night in the square. But he insisted strongly he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered into his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. All right, so kind of the first kind of scene, the first vignette that we have is these strangers going into a city. They're angels, we know this, or they are God, however that works out. However, again, you'd have to read the whole couple chapters to kind of wrap your arms around that. But they go into the city, and Lot sees them. So Lot is sitting at the city gate. This is where the elders of the city, this is where the prominent people of the city, this is where business was done, at the gate of the city. So it's not unusual that Lot would be at the gate of the city because that's where business was conducted. So these men come in, Lot sees them come in, and when he sees them kind of going to the center of the city, going to the city square, he actually goes to them and he invites them to find shelter in his house. Now, there's two things we could possibly read into this. First of all, we could read that Lot sees these men and recognizes them as strangers in the city, right? He does not recognize them. And so he does what is right and good in Middle Eastern culture, which is to offer them hospitality in his home, right? To not turn away the stranger or neglect the stranger, but to invite the stranger in to make sure that they have food, they have shelter, etc., right? You hear wash your feet, have a place to sleep, have a meal. The other thing is Lot possibly, and maybe probably, recognizes also that the city square of Sodom is a dangerous place to be overnight for strangers, right? They're obviously not from there, and so Lot recognizes that they are in danger where they are. It is not a safe city. And so he does what, again, is right and good, and what the people of God actually are called to do. That is offer hospitality, offer place for the stranger to find rest. Now, this involves risk, right? He doesn't know these two guys from Adam. And so he invites complete strangers to dine in his home. I don't want us to overlook that is a significant thing, right? To invite a stranger, because, again, who knows? Are they people who are scouting the city? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they robbers? Or are they thieves? Are they murderers? Right? All that sort of stuff. But Lot sees people in need, right, and invites them in, right? That is hospitality. And so kind of immediately off the bat, we see Lot kind of presented, if not as a righteous man, then as somebody who is trying to do right, upright, or good, or displaying the kind of hospitality that is called for by the people of God. So he does this, and he invites them in. And even though they first demur, right, they say, no, that's all right, you don't need to do that. We're just going to make camp here in the square of the city. We'll be fine. Lot doesn't let it go, right? Again, normal hospitality would say, come and stay with me, and then leave it at that. If they say no, they say no. But Lot sees that, perhaps again knows that they're in danger, knows that it's not safe for them, and invites them in and insists that they come into his home. Right, again, so Lot doesn't just do what is sort of expected. He goes over and above. He insists that they come. Insisting that a stranger stay in your house is a little bit different, right? But so Lot shows himself to be sort of in the vein of the people of God, because hospitality is a chief and cardinal virtue, not only of Middle Eastern culture, but of the people of God. And so he invites them in, and basically they have a meal together, right? That's what they do. They go, he offers them, all the stuff he said he would, right? To wash their feet, right? It's hot, it's desert, it's dusty, to refresh their feet, to throw some water on their faces, to sit down to a meal. It's interesting, it says unleavened bread, but that's probably because there's not enough time for the bread to rise because it's already in the evening, right? So he prepares a quick meal as much as he can at the time and invites them to stay, and they settle in for the night. So again, we see that Lot immediately displays something. He's the one who sees them, and he goes to them with an overture of kindness, of welcome, of protection even, perhaps, given what happens later. It's probably not unexpected what happens later in Lot's mind. But Lot knows that they are in danger and wants to do what is right and is good for the people of God, and that is invite the stranger in. And so we kind of see this immediately in Lot, this care for the stranger. A lot of times Lot is kind of perceived as, if not bad, then just sort of a neutral character. But I really think Genesis characterizes him in some ways as someone, if not righteous, then someone who leans towards righteousness, who displays sort of the characteristics of righteousness and leans in the direction of doing what is right and what is good, even when it is unexpected, and even, as we shall see in a moment, when it is dangerous. Okay, so I went really long last week, and I'm going to try not to do that this week and give Sheldon a chance to ask a question.
So,
you're good.
So there's several parallels here with these stories of Abraham and Lot, and as I was kind of reading this and studying about it, kind of what I kept reading other people interpret about this is that, Lot is not as righteous as Abraham. That Abraham is kind of the peak,
right?
And Lot is not quite measuring up, but he's still kind of doing it, even though it's in a different context. And so I was reading that and like, okay, that does make sense. But I was also thinking, and I'll make this statement, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. But it seems to me that I think one of the differences that I think that stuck out to me was that they accepted Abraham's request or Abraham's invitation right away.
Mm-hmm.
But then when Lot gives them that invitation, they say, no, it's fine, we'll stay in the square. And then he has to,
insist?
Invite again. Yeah, he has to insist. And he has this idea, this context, knowing what the people of Sodom would do, right? He knows that they would be in danger if they don't come stay with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find it interesting that, it's easy enough to welcome people in when it's like, hey, they might accept, they might not, and it's no skin off my back if they don't.
Right.
It's a whole other thing to be welcoming in these people that are being hunted, kind of, that the almost literally the entire town is going to come after. And so I'm just curious, I guess, if there's any significance to that, what you think about that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, part of the reason I use this text to talk about the context, which is radical hospitality, is in so many ways in this text, Lot goes out of his way and does more than we might expect, even as we'll see later, to the point of us going, ew, why, what kind of loving person would do that? But it's all for the sake of protecting these two. We have no indication that Lot knows that they're angelic or that it's God, right? From all we can tell, these are just two strangers who are in Sodom, whom Lot says who Lot insists to take under his protection, right? I wouldn't say, for those commentators say, well, it doesn't quite measure up, right? Well, he makes unleavened bread, Abraham makes a full meal and, kills the fatted calf. Well, right, they came to Abraham in the morning. There's time to make bread. There's time to kill a fatted calf and to roast the meat and to have it for dinner, right? You can do, ossobuco takes 6 hours to make. If you come in the morning, you can do that. If you come in the evening, as it was here, right, 5, 6 at night, whatever. You can't do all that stuff. You don't have the bread to make leaven, so you make unleavened bread. You throw together whatever you have at the time, right? I think that we tend to, just because of the context of all of this, because, well, why would Lot be in that city? We tend to look down on Lot, but the fact that he was brought out of Sodom shows that there was something unique about him vis-a-vis the rest, right? And so for me, I look at this and say, I want to say Lot was righteous in how he acted, because everything he did from beginning to end, at least as I read it, is for the protection of these two men, right? It is his responsibility as a person, and I will say as a person of God, that term doesn't exist at this particular point, right? There's no Israel yet. But as someone who's at least has familial relationship through Abraham to God, right? He shows the virtues of righteousness in protecting the stranger and protecting the vulnerable, right? From his perspective, these are two men in the midst of a large city, right? They are the definition of vulnerable. They aren't from around here. They don't know the customs. They don't know the depravity or whatever might be around, right? They don't speak the cultural language, right? And so Lot goes out of his way, and as you said, not just offering a place to stay, but insisting, right? No, really, you should come inside, right? That's not insignificant. To me, again, as we read about, if we read about Lot in sort of the context of everything he does is for the benefit and protection of these two men, we see that he is a righteous person, at least in that respect, as we come to hospitality. So going back to the Ezekiel text, right? In the context of that, Ezekiel points out Sodom was bad because they took advantage of those who were disadvantaged, right? Those who were vulnerable. Sodom did that. Throughout this text, we see that. Lot chooses to do the opposite, right? Not to take advantage of them or to leave them to their fate, right? But to actually go out of his way and put himself, and as we'll see, his family in danger for their sake. That seems to be righteousness at work. Again, how he goes about it, a little suspect, but we'll get into that. All right, so we'll move on in the text here. Before they had gone to bed, the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, do not do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." All right, so I label this indecent proposals. So again, as they're preparing for bed, remember, Lot has brought them in, he has fed them, he has taken care of them, he's given them everything that they need at that particular point. But it says the men of the whole city, so young and old, everyone from the city. Like, remember, Abraham has bargained for the fate of this city for the sake of 10 righteous. Abraham has said, God, if there's 10 righteous, you please don't destroy the city. And God agrees to that. So it's not incidental that we read that the entire city came out. Okay? Both young and old, right? Are there 10 righteous? Well, the entire city came out. I mean, the language used is sort of descriptive, saying that everyone but Lot and his family were there trying to do this for these men, right? So the men of the city, they gather at Lot's door. They know where they've been watching where these men went. They've been watching the house, and they go and they want to have sex with the men. Again, most of our discussions about the story here tends to focus on the sex part, right? That's where, for some reason, we always fixate on that particular part. I would venture to say that here, this is not about sex as much as it's about violence. It's not about sex as much as it's about taking advantage of the vulnerable. It's not about sex as much as it is dehumanizing another, making another person an object. In this case, an object for pleasure, but an object nonetheless. It's not an act. These aren't sexual acts. These are acts of violence. So I tend to want to, and I think Ezekiel points us to, right? To not focus so much on the fact that the men wanted to have sex with other men. I don't think that's the point. That's not the wickedness at work here. The wickedness at work here is that these men want to take advantage of other men. They want to rape them, which is wrong always, right? It is an act of violence. It is an act of domination. It is an act of taking advantage of the vulnerable, the weak. The entire city versus two men is not even odds, right? And so it is dehumanizing, it is depersonalizing, and that, to me, is what this is about. This is about the lack of hospitality, lack of care, lack of concern, or the acts of violence that are committed or that are proposed against these two men, right? It is sex by force, which is always wrong, an act of violence. And so that is the proposal that these men have, right? It's exploitation. It is a problem. It is wicked, no doubt, what they are doing, what they are proposing. It would be wicked if it were females who were there too, by the way, right? Let's just be clear on that. The wickedness here is the sex by force, is the violence, is the forcing and depersonalizing and using another as an object rather than as a subject, so to speak, not treating them as human. So that is the context from which we're coming from. So let's contrast this for a moment. Lot sees these men, sees them as worthy, right? They are humans who have come into the midst. They are worthy of care. They are worthy of being fed. They are worthy of protection. And so that is what Lot has displayed towards them, right? He has seen them as persons and treated them as such. Whereas the men of Sodom saw these two as objects and treated them as such, right? Person versus object. Lot has shown what? Hospitality, to see the stranger even as person and worthy of love and worthy of care, versus exploitation, seeing the other as object, worthy of only use for my pleasure or my ends. And that is, for me, at least as I read it from the context of Ezekiel, the operative thing that's at work here. It is the hospitality of Lot versus the inhospitality and exploitation of the rest of the city, right? So we know now that Lot is in a sticky situation, right? These men have come with violent intent. They don't present themselves as people who are just going to go away if they don't get what they want. It's an angry mob. And Lot is one person in a house against an angry mob. Those odds aren't good. And so Lot has a choice. What does Lot do? Open the door, let him in, shut the door and bar the door. Lot does what he feels is necessary, which I would say is wrong, but does it nonetheless. But instead of judging Lot for the wrongness of his actions were wrong. Let's look at it in the context of what Lot is willing to do and to give up for the sake of the protection of these two men. Again, I think it is wrong what he offered the men of Sodom. However, he does it, in my opinion, not for lack of love for his daughters, not because he doesn't care, not because he sees them as anything less, but he says, this is my option. His care for these two men, these strangers in his house, his duty in his own mind of protection for them extends to the literal, almost sacrifice of his own family. Wrong, though I think this action may have been, and I think it was wrong, what he offered. So as Lot comes to this decision, and in the moment he says, okay, here's what I'll do. If sex is what they want, which obviously it wasn't what they wanted, he offers his daughters. They're virgins. They've never known a man. Take them. Do what you want with them, right? Again, horrible. Please don't. I am not justifying this action. However, looking at it in the context of Lot says, I must protect them even at the cost of my own family. Hospitality always involves risk. I'm not sure any of us should, in fact, I know none of us should do what Lot did, but hospitality comes with risk. And this is where it moves from hospitality even more into the radical range, right? the risks and the ends to which Lot is willing to go, again, offering his daughters isn't necessarily at this point personal risk. But I think Lot was like most fathers who loved his children dearly. And I don't imagine that was an easy thing for him to do. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But he sees that as his option. I must protect the stranger, so much so that I'm willing to offer my family. That's sort of an either-or dichotomy that I'm not sure is necessarily the first place to go, but that's what happens, right? That's why I call that indecent proposal number 2, right? It's not good, it's not right. But this is what Lot does, and this is the lengths to which Lot goes to say, I want to protect these two who are entrusted in my care. He sees his duty to the stranger that deeply, okay? What was he thinking? Again, he feels he's at an impasse. It's either or. I have to do something. If it's sex they want, then I will offer my own to spare the strangers. This might recall some stuff. We are willing to do a lot of things for friends, for family, but for strangers, it's much harder, right? Again, Paul talks about in Romans, right? It's very rare that a man would die for someone he loves, but for a stranger, right? And then begins to talk about how Christ demonstrated Christ's love by offering Christ's own self for a stranger, right? A lot of us would go to extreme lengths for family, for friends. For strangers we just met that morning, not many of us. But again, this is where the hospitality goes into radical and even foolish hospitality, perhaps for Lot. And again, I don't excuse the behavior, but it does show. I don't see Lot. If Lot was an evil or wicked person, he'd have just taken the guys and shoved them out the door and said, "Have your way," right? But he doesn't do that. His duty, honor, and I think theologically in his mind bound to their protection. I have taken them under my roof. And so I will do anything I can, even to this horrible length, in order to protect them. I'm glad that the men don't take him up on the offer. I, for one, am glad that doesn't happen. But that's what it is. He takes his responsibility for hospitality that seriously. And that's in verse 8, that's the last line, right? But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Of course, as a dad, I would say that protection ought to extend to your children. But again, we see the lengths that he feels he has to go to protect even the stranger whom he has vowed protection to. I'll stop there because we could go on with that.
So I don't have a whole lot to add, but I think that this definitely highlights in our vision that word radical.
Right.
I think this is pretty radical and like you said, maybe foolish. But I can't help but think about how radical it is that Christ showed his love for us by literally dying for us. Those of us who will never meet the human Jesus that walked the earth, that as radical as it is, he gave his life for all of us, and that sacrifice, and I don't think that is exactly paralleled here with Lot, but I think that radical nature of it is what Lot is at least kind of striving for. He knows that God calls us to be welcoming to the poor, the wounded, the broken, the powerless, and I think that he is recognizing that and doing his best to exemplify that. But I also, my mind is also, and you said something I can't remember what it is now, but it made me think to another parallel with Abraham, that comes a few chapters after this with Abraham and Isaac, that Abraham is kind of doing his duty because he loves God, and he knows that he is a follower of God, that he needs to obey God to the point where he is ready to sacrifice his son. And I don't know. Again, I say this, and then you can tell me if it's a foolish comparison to make. But in a sense, this is what Lot is doing as well, is willing to sacrifice his daughter. I don't know.
Yeah, there's that kind of language there. There's some interesting, and this might be a complete rabbit trail, so I won't spend much time here. But there's some interesting stuff in just work done on the sacrifice of Isaac. One of the interpretations of that is the sacrifice, that sort of whole vignette, that show is actually what, for the people of God, puts an end to child sacrifice or speaks against child sacrifice. So it's almost like this set piece where God sets it up so that in the end God can say, no, I don't demand your children anymore. But I don't demand, anymore. I never demanded your children, right? Because in the culture around these folks, it was common in some of the religions to offer up children, right? You hear a lot about Moloch in the Old Testament, and that's what it is. That Moloch, there would be a statue with hands like this, and they'd build fire, and they'd put their kid, in that, and they'd offer up their children to Moloch, right? Something costly to them so that they would get the benefit of good harvest, usually is kind of the ideas there. Or fertility is another one. And so sort of the Abraham-Isaac thing is sort of definitive of God saying, no, I do not require this of you. I will provide the sacrifices, right? There's something else. There's a substitution. But not even that, but that God's just saying, I don't require this. This in the stream of sort of monotheism, or in the stream of worship of the development of the people of God, this is where God very early on says, no, I don't demand this of you. These other gods might, but I don't, and I won't demand this of you. So going back to Lot, Lot may have felt that's kind of his only choice, and I think that that shows the narrowness of what he thought his options were. There's always I think there's a third way of saying, no, you don't get anything, right? But Lot's trying to be a diplomat, right? He's trying to offer them something to satiate them so that they won't knock down the door and kill them all anyway. So this is what Lot sees. Now, that he offers his daughters, that's the sort of, he doesn't offer himself, he offers his kids. Again, wrong-headed, wrong way of thinking, but he does it. But he does it for the sake of these two. And I would also venture to say that God provides a way out so that he doesn't have to. So that right, there's some way in which God says, no, that's not what I want you to do to protect these two. Right? God's not willing to let that happen to be protected. As we see later, these two can protect themselves, right? They are not without help. But again, Lot doesn't know that at this point, right? So Lot, what do I do? And he sees this, again, wrongly. Many of us make very wrong decisions when the pressure's on because we see it as our only options. But he is trying to do what is good by these two men by offering something that is dear to him, right? He offers something that is, quote unquote, his, right? His children, to protect these independent people, right? These people who aren't his. His obligation to them, as he sees it, is protection. And so he's going to offer even what is his in order to affect that for the sake of the other. And that's where the radical nature of this comes in. Yeah. So I know that's not always a sufficient answer for people in this, but I think we see that God's kind of always in the midst of all this saying, no, that's not what I want. What are you talking about? I don't want your daughters. I don't want you to offer your daughters for my sake. But that's, again, what's going on. So the men of Sodom don't take Lot's daughters, which is good. I'm glad to hear that. But what does happen is this. They say, get out of the way, they replied. This fellow has come here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them, and that's saying something. And they kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But when the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back inside the house and shut the door, then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness so that they could not find the door. So again, we see that, that fortunately and providentially, right, God is not willing to let either Lot's daughters suffer or Lot himself or the rest of Lot's family. And so we see that the men don't want that. They want these two strangers. Why they want the two strangers, we don't know. Like, what's the point? Domination, they think they're evil. They just think they're tools to be exploited. But what's interesting is when Lot says no, he takes great risk because they've shown they're willing to go to violent lengths to get what they want. And so Lot takes on this great risk of not only taking these men in the first place, but keeping them under his protection. Again, this is why I think Lot presents, at least at this point, as righteous in his act, or at least in his intent of care for these two men. And I think, again, this is ultimately, as the story goes, I think this is why Lot was saved through it, not because he was a perfect person per se, but because of the ways in which he displays the character, again, the character of hospitality and love in God in protection for these vulnerable, at least as he sees them, men. But what's fascinating is we know that Lot had moved into the area. So Lot's not indigenous to Sodom. He moved in when he and Abraham kind of broke up. And as soon as Lot says no, they turn on him, right? Now this person who has lived among them, who was a friend or whatever, has now become an outsider. Again, he moves from being like us, one of us, an insider, to now, again, dehumanized. If I can make someone an outsider, not like us, a foreigner, then I don't have to treat them with the same dignity, respect, care that I treat my neighbor, my friend, the person who thinks, looks, acts, whatever, like me. They turn this into an us versus them. So first, it's us, right? The men of Sodom who want these men who are outsiders, right, to exploit. And then when Lot doesn't give them what they want, they now do what mobs do, and they depersonalize anyone who stands in their way as them, right? An object to be overcome. Who is this foreigner to stand in judgment over us, right? He's not one of us. He doesn't think like us. He doesn't act like us. He doesn't want what we want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they begin to press in on him and threaten him. Now he's in danger as well, right? And that's what we do. When we don't get what we want, we depersonalize the other and try to take what we want. Every war, the way that we justify killing others in war is by depersonalizing them and making them the other, right? So we make up slurs about Germans or about Japanese or about whoever, right? Even in so-called good wars, right? We have to depersonalize the other, make them not a person or evil so that we can justify what we do to them. And this is what's going on here. And even our own neighbors and friends, right? So in our political climate, if I want to hate somebody, all I have to do is to make them into the other. They're not from around here. They're an outsider. They're a northerner. They're a southerner. They're a Republican. They're a Democrat. Right? We label them so that they're not like us, so that we can do things we wouldn't do to people who are like us. We can treat them in ways that are not consistent with love and care of our neighbor, as we know, at least in the church, we have been called to do. Right? The history of our country, right? Slavery was justified because those people who are black are not human. Make them other, make them not like us, because we wouldn't treat a human like that, but we can treat those who are subhuman like that. And this is what happens. We see this is throughout Scripture. This is what happens. You demonize, you depersonalize, you treat them as other, and now all of a sudden I can treat you in ways that are inconsistent with what I say I believe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what happens here. Is Lot goes from an elder sitting at the gate to the outsider, to not like us, because he is judging us. He doesn't think like us. He doesn't have the mind like we do. And so they begin to now put him in danger. Right? And this is where God steps in and says, I'm not willing to let Lot die for this. I'm not willing to let his kids die for this or be exploited for this. And so God takes action. The men outside are struck blind. Lot is brought back in, and we know as the story goes, that's the end of this story, but as the story goes, Lot is then taken out with his family out of Sodom as Sodom is destroyed. So apparently Lot and his family, or at least Lot, are the only righteous in this city. God couldn't find 10. But again, we see this sort of this movement here of Lot showing himself to be righteous, showing himself to be a protector, showing himself to put himself and his family at great risk so that these men might not be exploited, might not die, might not be taken advantage of emotionally, mentally, physically, sexually, right? All that stuff. And he goes to such great lengths. God, of course, at this point, Lot finds out that these men were capable of protecting themselves, right? And they're struck blind, and Lot and his family, at least in the moment, are saved from sort of that immediate peril. But Lot goes to such lengths that he shows not just hospitality, not just ordinary kindness, as we might call it, but extraordinary, radical hospitality. Sheldon.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in here, so I'm trying to think even what to say. I guess not necessarily a lot of good stuff. A lot of important stuff to notice amidst the bad stuff. But the thing that I keep coming back to is like you were saying about Sodom, and the Sodomites are seeking out the outsiders to further perpetrate their outsiderness.
Right.
And that is completely opposite of how God created humanity.
Right.
He created, I guess, not even just humanity, but all of God's creation is created to be in unity.
Right.
And God, as we see, God despises things that go against that unity, that further perpetrate that division. And I think we see when he comes and talks to Abraham that he has noticed that that is what they are doing. They are seeking out the foreigners and abusing them. And yet he still gives them kind of this one more chance that proves to be not any different than the others.
Yeah, it doesn't go well.
Yeah.
Not for Sodom anyway.
Yeah. And so, man, it's just hard. It's hard for me to get past that, past the idea that, and I say this dwelling on, or I guess thinking about how I unknowingly or maybe knowingly perpetrate division as well, just even in small things. And I think that it's not, we should read this as not saying we need to view everyone exactly the same, right? We all have uniqueness. We have all been made differently, purposefully. And so it's not to disregard what makes us unique, what makes us different. But the fact that the Sodomites are not just recognizing that these foreigners have come in, but they are seeking them out to cause harm.
Right.
That is, in my mind, what is the true wickedness there. Mm-hmm. And so, but at the same time, I think God is looking for us to be more like Lot, rather than just recognizing the foreigners and saying, oh yeah, like I love them and they're children of God and yada yada yada, and then not doing anything about it. That is not what we're called to do. We're not called to just recognize and do nothing, but we are called to be like Lot, who extends this radical hospitality, right? The extension part of it is the hospitality in action. I'm getting getting stirrings of what you've been preaching on Sunday mornings, and will this week as well. Mm-hmm. That we are not just called to be, right, but we are called to be love in action and to do. And so that I'm rambling, but all of that to recognize, I am recognizing more and more in this story the extension of the radical hospitality, that it's not just like I could offer this hospitality, or these people look like they might be in need, and that's great for them, and I will support them, but like actually going out and doing that.
Yeah, there's an amount of out of the way hospitality. Like he goes out of his way to offer hospitality, and beyond what we would consider normal, to ensure the safety of those who are in his care. And he doesn't know their religious affiliation. He doesn't, he may not know where they're from, right? They recognize them as foreigners, outsiders, but cities were relatively small. You knew everybody, right? So a stranger was known. I mean, like, you knew someone who was a stranger. And I think, as you say, that the wicked people sought them out to exploit them, right? I'm going to say this. So I read a book last week about the gold rush in the Klondike, right? And I've read multiple books. This one was a shorter work that was by a guy who did a larger work about that. And the story that he told in this story and the other one that I read, and it's fiction, but basically the people who made money in the Klondike were not those who were mining for gold. They were those who were selling to them, who were in many cases exploiting them. Right, so it wasn't just that, like in the Klondike, that it's like, well, we'll offer a fee for a service for a reasonable fee. It was we will recognize that these people are coming, to Alaska, to the, let's say, to the Chilkoot Pass, right? They had to have a year of supplies before they were allowed to go up the pass, right? So now they're captive, and so people can jack up the prices and exploit them. Or when they get to Dawson City, right, they need to claim, and well, this guy's obviously new around here, so let's take advantage of him. Let's sell him a bum claim, or let's sell him this, or let's sell him that, or let's tell him he needs, I don't know, a thing that goes beep, right? When he really doesn't need a thing. But recognizing the outsider and then taking advantage of that. But sometimes that's what we do, right? We recognize they're not from around here. And so that's the exact opposite of hospitality. But what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to recognize they're not from around here. How can I help them? Not to not be taken advantage of, but to offer them protection from those who would take advantage of them, exploit them. Human trafficking is a great example of how we ought to be involved in this. How can we go to lengths to make sure not only that we protect our kids, that's important, but that we actively work against the exploitation of others who are vulnerable. Some of our older folks, there's so many Social Security and Medicare and all these things scams. How are we actively working to make sure that they aren't taken advantage of because of their age or because of their need, right? It's not ignorance, or it's not stupidity, it's not that they just don't know any better. It's just that there's so much out there, and there's so many things that people have to keep track of, that when you get a call from someone who says they represent the SSA, you want to, right? So how do we actively work and not just sort of take passive stance and be like, well, they should know better, but actively say, okay, how can we work to inform, to help, to protect, to remind, right? Those of us who grew up with computers know that if you get an email, you click on who it's from, and if you don't recognize that address, right? If it says from Amazon, but it doesn't come from Amazon, it's not legit. But if you didn't grow up around computers, you don't know that, right? That's just second nature to some of us, but it's not. So how do we go out of our ways to make sure that people aren't exploited? Not just to say, well, whoops. But again, this includes people who are not like us. I'm going to move on to my next one because this is the point I want to make. My clicker's not working. Will you click me to the next slide? There it is. Okay. So radical hospitality. So first of all, hospitality is welcome of the stranger, right? That's hospitality 101. Welcoming people into our midst, right? Taking care of them, being kind, being generous to them. Someone visits your church, invite them out to lunch, right? That would be hospitality. Someone visits your church, invite them in, talk to them for a little bit, see what works for them, invite them to sit by you, introduce them to someone else. That is sort of, I will call, run-of-the-mill hospitality. And some of us even struggle with that, don't get me wrong. But again, hospitality is welcome. Think of the Good Samaritan, right? Welcome to the stranger. Who is my neighbor? Well, anyone who is in need, right? So that's regular hospitality, just making sure other people are taken care of, right? If we see someone new to town, show them around, introduce them to a realtor, whatever, right? That's just sort of run-of-the-mill hospitality. But we're talking, and again, we have adopted the language of radical hospitality intentionally because we as the church are called to go above and beyond, right? So this also includes not just care for the inside, right? For insiders, for those who are like us, but for those who are on the outside as well, for outsiders, right? Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, who among you, if his son or daughter asked for bread, would give him a snake? Well, of course none of us would, right? That's normal hospitality, taking care of those who are like us, right? Think of like us being white or conservative or Christian or American or Republican or Democrat, right? Whatever labels you bear or identify with, those are the people who are like you. Hospitality is taking care of people. Radical hospitality is going out of your way to take care of people who don't look like you, act like you, believe like you. Praying not just for your friends, but for your enemies as well, right? Loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you, even feeding your enemies, it talks about in Scripture. That is radical hospitality. It's above and beyond. So it's not how do I put America first. Sorry to get political, right? For the church, America first is not how we are called to operate. We are called to operate that each person is given dignity and humanity by God, and we take care of whoever we can and whoever is in our midst. That means I take care of the person before I ask their immigration status, right? That is, I welcome the person in and don't worry about their religion, their race, right? I treat them as humans should be treated, regardless of the labels they wear, visible or invisible, right? So race is a very visible one. Radical hospitality, it shouldn't be radical, but radical hospitality is saying, I care about you regardless of your race. Radical hospitality says, I will offer you hospitality in all the ways that count, significant, feed, protect, whatever, regardless of what religion you are. Not because those things don't matter, but because your humanity matters most to me. And those other things do not negate my call as a fellow human, as a person of God, more importantly, to care for you and to love, right? You are my neighbor, regardless of race, ethnicity, voting status, right? Immigration status, it doesn't matter. My duty is to care for you, right? Regardless. And this is radical hospitality. And this is why this one is an inspirational or aspirational thing for us, because this is not easy. It goes above and beyond. It is in sometimes risky, right? Inviting strangers into your midst, into your homes, as it's talked about in the New Testament, is risky because we don't know them. We don't know what their intentions are, right? But we invite them in, right? We invite people into our midst. We don't know what their intentions are, and we welcome them as a brother or sister. We don't know their intentions, and that is going to be risky because sometimes they have bad intentions. But radical hospitality says we will welcome them nonetheless. Now, where I want to just sort of end this particular aspect, and we're going to move on quick, and I'm going to I don't know, Sheldon may want to say something here, so I'll give him an opportunity, but we're over time. Again, go figure. Is In the first century, the first century church, the early church, were known for this kind of hospitality, right? There's a famous letter that Pliny the Elder sent to the Emperor Trajan. No, that's not the one I'm thinking of. It's a letter that the emperor was sending to his chief priests, and the pagan priests. And he was talking to them about the sect of Christians. And he was telling them about all the things that the Christians did, right? They fed people regardless of their religion, right? They welcomed and took care of widows and of orphans regardless, right? They offered compassion to any and to all. They took care of the sick. They provided burial services for those who weren't part of a burial guild, and that was an important thing, right? To be buried properly was important, and you had to have money and be a part of these things, right? And so they took care of people regardless of their social, economic status. And at the root of it, the emperor tells his priests, be more like them, because they're converting all of our people. And it's just mind-blowing, right, that the early church was so radically hospitable, at least in these ways, that the emperor knew about it and commanded his priests to do the same, to look like them so that they, by their love, could win converts. Now, that wasn't the purpose of the early church doing it. They did it because they were called to love. But the result was people said, see how they love, and wanted to be, I mean, who doesn't want to be a part of that kind of radical love, that radical hospitality? If you're especially on the recipient end of that, I didn't deserve it, but I got it. I'd like to know a little bit more about this community of which I'm part of. Why do you do this? Well, Jesus. But that's how we're called to live, in those ways of offering this kind of hospitality towards others, so that people look and say, see how they love. The church, rightly or wrongly, is not known as a loving place right now in our culture, right? I think we could go very far to changing that perception, at least on an individual level, as we offer this radical hospitality. Doesn't mean we don't preach the gospel, doesn't mean we don't talk about what we believe, but it means that we bring people in and offer them love, kindness, and compassion regardless of whether they agree with us or not, right? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That is radical hospitality in my book. Sheldon, question?
Just one quick thing to add.
Okay.
That kind of right along with what you just said with see how they love. That we do this, we extend radical hospitality. We love without reservation, not in order that they might become Christians, in order that they might come to our church.
Right.
It has nothing to do with the end goal. It's because that is what it means to be a follower of God, is to do this. And so it's something that we don't invite someone over for dinner and hope that by what we say, by what we do, that they become a Christian. Mm-hmm. That would be great. But that is not why we do what we do. That is not why we love how we love. That is not why we extend radical hospitality.
Right.
And I want to say it's Carey Nieuwhof I can't remember the exact quote, but basically along the lines that the world looks a lot more Christian sometimes than Christians do. The world is oftentimes more accepting and more hospitable to those in need more than Christians, because Christians can be so in your face about wanting to convert.
Right.
and the world doesn't need more people who are can't think of the word, who say one thing and then do something different.
Yeah.
Right? Say that we are extending radical hospitality, but then don't actually do it.
Right.
And the world doesn't always get that right either. That's not what I'm saying. But as Christians, we are called to provide an alternative to what the world is offering. And I think that extending radical hospitality is a large part of that. Radical hospitality without reservation, without ulterior motive.
Yeah, without ulterior motive is hard. Because we rightly want people to know Jesus. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to want that for people. It's a good thing to talk to people about that. It's not a good thing to use another form as a bait to get people to con's the wrong word, but to use people for that end, right? We treat people with love, kindness, compassion because people are worthy of love, kindness, compassion. And we tell people about Jesus because people need love, kindness, compassion, and Jesus has it. But oftentimes the perception is, you invited me here to tell me about Jesus, and if I don't buy what you're selling, you're not going to include me any further. And that's, I think, where we sometimes get it wrong. If you don't accept what I have to offer, right? If you don't accept when I talk to you about Jesus Christ, you're no longer welcome, or I'm not going to extend the kind of hospitality I was, right? We don't extend hospitality for the purpose of making them believe. We extend hospitality because we have been loved and we are called to love. And we tell people about Jesus because we have been called to love. But we also continue in relationship regardless, right? The gospel is not like Amway, where if they turn it down, we move on. The gospel is the gospel of Jesus Christ, which compels us to love regardless. And I think, again, that is the difference between hospitality, right? I'll welcome you and I'll offer you this free dinner if you listen to my sales pitch, right? I've taken advantage of many a free dinner in order to get free dinner, and then I had to listen to a sales pitch, but, I knew that was coming. But that's not how the church ought to work. It's like, have a free dinner. And we talk about Jesus because Jesus is important to us, but have a free dinner and come tomorrow, and you can have a free dinner tomorrow too, right? And you don't have to quote unquote buy it. Even if you don't buy it, that makes us sad, but if you buy it, you're still welcome to come eat with us. And we value you as your personhood rather than as your decision. The decision's important, but the value of the person does not lie in the decision. I'm getting a little too technical with that, so I'm gonna end with these questions. Sheldon, if you can go to the next slide. I don't know if I lost my battery in my clicker or what, but so the next slide is just going to be a couple questions I'd like you to ask maybe yourself in all of this. There you go. First of all, how would you define hospitality? I intentionally didn't define it real strictly, but how would you define hospitality? What would make hospitality under your definition radical? And then begin to consider who the outsiders are in our community. So think again back to the story of Lot. He welcomed the outsider, the stranger, and took them under his protection regardless of the risk to him and his family. Who are the outsiders who are in our midst, who we either overlook or just maybe give a cursory glance to? How can we extend radical hospitalities to the outsiders in our day, in our age, in our time, and in our place? So with that and with that thought, we will move, and I'm going to throw it over to Sheldon and Kayla, who are going to be leading us in worship. And after we have a time of worship, I just want to give you this benediction. I won't come back to do the benediction, but may the God of peace himself give you love, that you might love and offer radical hospitality to your neighbors and to those in your midst. Thank you for coming, and won't you continue to worship with us today?
Come all you sinners, come find power of hell forever defeated. Now it is where I'm walking in freedom. For God so loved the world. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, for the wonders of His love. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, for the wonders of His love. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. The power of hell forever defeated. Now it is where I'm walking in freedom. For God so loved the world. Bring all your failures, bring your addictions. Come lay them down at the foot of the cross. Jesus is waiting. God so loved the world. Welcome the traveler, broken and poor. Welcome the weary, longing for more. Welcome the sinners, welcome the saints. Step out of the wreckage from all your mistakes. Come to the fountain of the redeemed. Drink of the water that's setting us free. Meet the Messiah who came to save. Jesus, the truth and the life and the way. Singing, whoa, we are the people of God, redeemed and washed by the blood of the Lamb. You made some mistakes, too, I'm afraid. For that very reason, the Messiah was slain. Here on our knees, repentance is key to breaking these chains and setting us free. We're taking back lives, we're taking back peace, we're taking back hope, we're taking back dreams. Love of a Savior is setting us free. This is the anthem of the redeemed. We're taking back life, we're taking back peace, we're taking back hope, we're taking back dreams. The love of a Savior is setting us free. This is the anthem of the redeemed. Singing, whoa, we are the people of God, redeemed sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken-hearted, let rescue begin. Come find your mercy, oh sinner, come here. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can feel.
Earth has no sorrow that heaven can feel.
So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your faith. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your head, lay down your heart, come as you are. There's hope for the hopeless and all those who stray.
Come
Sit at the table, come taste the grace. There's rest for the weary, rest that endures.
Earth has no sorrow that heaven can cure.
Lay down your burden, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your faith. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, come as you are. There's joy for the morning, oh sinner, be still. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can feel. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can heal. Lay down your burden.